A Template for Understanding Big Debt Crises by Ray Dalio. Picture this. It's 2007. The world is riding high. The economy's humming along. Stocks are climbing. And houses? They just keep getting more valuable. It feels like we've reached some kind of permanent prosperity. Like maybe this time really is different. For most people, the good times seem unstoppable. But tucked away in a quiet Connecticut office surrounded by woods, one of the world's sharpest investors, Ray Dalio, is seeing something completely different. He's not popping champagne, he's battening down the hatches. Not for just any storm, but for what he calls a 100-year flood, the kind that fundamentally reshapes everything and gets talked about for generations. His team at Bridgewater Associates had spent years building what they called a depression gauge, basically a sophisticated alarm system designed to spot the warning signs of total financial meltdown, the kind not seen since the 1930s. And in 2007, that gauge was flashing bright red. While everyone else saw endless growth, Dalio saw a massive bubble ready to burst, inflated by an invisible force that's shaped human civilization for thousands of years: debt. He understood that this boom, like every great boom in history, wasn't just a golden age of prosperity. It was actually the giddy final act before a predictable and painful collapse. And because he understood the pattern, he was able to steer his company through the crisis successfully while the rest of the world crashed and burned. So how did he pull it off? Well, he didn't have a crystal ball. What he had was a map, a template, a deep understanding of the simple, logical, repeating patterns that drive how economies rise and fall. Today, I want to walk you through that map. By the time we're done, you'll have a mental framework that'll completely change how you interpret the news, the economy, and the world around you. You'll understand the hidden rhythm underneath all those booms and busts. This isn't just about economics. It's about understanding the machinery that shapes our lives, our opportunities, and our future. It's a template for seeing how the world actually works. So, where do we start? With a surprisingly simple idea. Think about Monopoly for a second. Early in the game, everyone's got cash, and it feels great to spend it. You're snapping up properties, boardwalk, park place, the works. You feel wealthy because you own stuff. At this stage, property is everything. But as the game progresses, things shift. The board fills up with houses and hotels. Landing on someone else's space becomes seriously expensive. Suddenly, the cash you need to pay rent matters way more than the properties you own. Players who've overextended themselves, loaded up on properties but light on cash, are forced to sell their prized assets at bargain prices just to survive. Now cash is king. The best Monopoly players recognize this shift. They know when to buy and when to hold cash. They understand the rhythm of the game. Now let's spice things up. What if the bank could make loans? Imagine you could borrow money to buy more hotels than you could actually afford with your own cash. What if you could deposit extra cash to earn interest? What if players could buy and sell properties on credit, with promises to pay later? If you can picture that version, congratulations. You've just imagined a nearly perfect model of our entire global economy. This is the central insight in Ray Dalio's masterpiece. He argues that the economy isn't some mysterious, unpredictable beast. It's a machine, a relatively straightforward machine, that operates on logical cause and effect principles. And the biggest gear driving that machine, the one that influences almost everything else, is credit. Credit is fascinating when you think about it. It's essentially giving someone buying power they don't currently have, in exchange for a promise to pay it back later. That promise is what we call debt. When you swipe a credit card, you're basically creating money from thin air. You and the merchant agree on a transaction, and boom, a new credit asset and a new credit liability spring into existence. It didn't come from anywhere. It was created from a promise. This creative power is beautiful. It lets us build things we couldn't otherwise afford. Families buy homes. Entrepreneurs launch businesses. Governments construct infrastructure. Credit, when used productively, drives growth and human progress. But here's the catch. When you borrow money, you're not just borrowing from a lender, you're borrowing from your future self. You're creating a future moment where you'll have to spend less than you earn to pay it back. If you make $50,000 a year but spend $60,000 for a few years using credit, you're setting up a future period where you'll only be able to spend $40,000 to balance things out. This simple pattern, spending more than you make, followed by spending less, creates a cycle. And this holds true whether we're talking about you, me, or an entire country's economy. Dalio explains there are two main cycles to watch. First is the short-term debt cycle, usually called the business cycle, which runs about 5 to 8 years. Second, and way more important for understanding major crises, is the long-term debt cycle, typically lasting 50 to 75 years. Think of it like ocean waves. Business cycles are those smaller waves that come and go regularly. The long-term debt cycle is the tide itself, rising slowly, almost invisibly, over decades, then receding. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't just a big wave. It was the tide turning, just like it did during the Great Depression in 1929. So how does this long-term tide actually work? It starts in a period where debt levels are low. People are cautious, remembering the last painful downturn, but gradually things improve. Credit becomes easier to access. Central banks, the institutions controlling money and credit supply, lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending. This kicks off a beautiful, self-reinforcing upward spiral. When credit flows easily, people borrow more. More borrowing means more spending. And one person's spending becomes another person's income. As spending rises, incomes rise. As incomes climb, asset values, stocks, houses, increase because people have more money to buy them, and corporate profits grow. When asset prices climb, people feel wealthier, they have more collateral, so they can borrow even more. And lenders happily oblige because everyone looks creditworthy during a boom. This cycle repeats, pushing spending, incomes, and asset prices higher and higher. For a long time, this feels absolutely fantastic. It feels like we've achieved permanent prosperity. But beneath the surface, an invisible problem is growing. Debt is rising much faster than income. You can only stretch a rubber band so far. The promises to deliver money, debt, are growing way faster than the actual income needed to fulfill those promises. This is the bubble phase. Dalio identifies 7 clear, measurable signs that a market is bubbling. It's basically a checklist for spotting financial disaster before it arrives. First, prices are high compared to traditional measures. Second, prices assume unsustainably rapid future appreciation. Everyone expects the rocket ride to continue. Third, there's widespread bullish sentiment. Your barber, your uncle, everyone's talking about their market gains. Fourth, purchases are heavily financed through leverage. People aren't buying with their own money, they're borrowing aggressively. Fifth, buyers have made exceptionally extended forward purchases, like businesses stockpiling inventory, afraid prices will climb even higher. Sixth, new buyers flood the market. People who've never invested suddenly jump in, terrified of missing out. And seventh, stimulative monetary policy threatens to inflate the bubble further. The central bank keeps rates low, adding fuel to the fire. In the years before 2008, the housing market ticked every single one of these boxes, just like the stock market did before 1929. This upward cycle can last for decades. A key reason is the role of central banks. As the cycle progresses, whenever the economy stumbles, the central bank steps in and lowers interest rates. Lowering rates is like economic magic. It makes borrowing cheaper, encouraging more spending. It reduces existing debt payments, freeing up cash. And it pushes asset prices higher, making everyone feel wealthier. Each time the economy falters, the central bank cuts rates a bit more, pushing debt and asset prices to new, higher levels. This creates a series of shorter business cycles that build on each other, with each peak and trough carrying more debt than the last. This continues until the magic runs out. Eventually, interest rates get so low they hit zero, and at zero, the central bank loses its most powerful tool. It can't stimulate the economy further by cutting rates. This is when the tide turns. This is the top. The market top is a moment of dangerous illusion. Things are so good they seemingly can't improve, yet everyone believes they will. The market is fully bought in, fully leveraged, and perfectly positioned for reversal. The trigger is often the central bank itself. Realizing things are overheating, it finally raises interest rates to cool things down. But by this point, the system is so fragile, so dependent on easy credit, that even a modest rate increase is enough to pop the bubble. Suddenly, the cost of servicing all that debt exceeds the amount of new money that can be borrowed. The self-reinforcing upward spiral violently reverses into a self-reinforcing downward spiral. This is the depression phase. Asset prices start falling. As they drop, collateral values plummet. Lenders panic and pull back on lending. People and businesses, desperate for cash, are forced to sell assets. This wave of selling drives prices down further. Remember, one person's spending is another's income. As people cut spending, incomes fall across the entire economy. As incomes drop, people become less creditworthy. And the credit we thought was money, it vanishes. When you buy something with a credit card, you create credit. When the lender realizes you might not repay them, that credit asset on their books simply disappears. It doesn't transfer somewhere else. It's just gone. People discover that much of what they thought was wealth was nothing more than promises from others, and those promises are breaking. This is the truly painful part of the cycle. It's what Dalio calls an ugly deleveraging. In a normal recession, the central bank fixes things by cutting interest rates. But in a depression, rates are already at zero. That lever is broken. This precise formula creates a depression, exactly what happened in the United States from 1929 to 1932, and again in 2008. The economy is trapped. The deflationary forces of austerity and debt defaults are overwhelming. People spend less, debts get written off. But because one person's debts are another's assets, writing off debts destroys wealth, leading to even less spending. It's a vicious cycle that policymakers often initially make worse. Their instinct is to demand austerity. It makes sense, right? If you're drowning in debt, tighten your belt and spend less. The problem is, when everyone does it simultaneously, the economic collapse accelerates. As spending falls, incomes drop, and the debt-to-income ratio actually worsens. This is the critical moment where policymakers face a choice that will determine whether the country endures years of hardship or manages a graceful recovery. Dalio explains there are only 4 levers policymakers can pull to reduce debt levels relative to income. 1. Austerity. People, businesses, and governments spend less. As we've seen, this is deflationary and painful. 2. Debt defaults and restructurings. Lenders accept less than they're owed. Also deflationary and destroys wealth rapidly. 3. Printing money. The central bank creates new money to buy financial assets and government debt. This is inflationary and stimulative. 4. Wealth transfers. Taking from the haves and giving to the have-nots. Politically explosive and rarely happens on sufficient scale without revolution. A painful, ugly depression happens when policymakers rely too heavily on the first 2 levers, austerity and defaults, without balancing them with enough of the third, printing money. But a beautiful deleveraging, as Dalio calls it, is absolutely possible. A beautiful deleveraging happens when policymakers find the right balance. They use enough stimulative, inflationary forces, like printing money, to perfectly offset the deflationary, depressive forces like austerity and defaults. People often wonder, won't printing money cause runaway inflation? Dalio's answer is brilliantly simple. Not if it's just replacing the credit that's disappeared. Remember, spending is what matters. $1 of spending paid with money has the same effect on prices as a dollar paid with credit. When credit vanishes, the central bank can print money to fill the void, and if balanced correctly, it isn't inflationary. It simply prevents deflation. The goal is getting the rate of nominal income growth, real growth plus inflation, slightly higher than the interest rate on debt. Think of it this way. If your country has a debt-to-income ratio of 100% and the interest rate is 2%, your debt grows to 102 next year. If income only grows 1%, your debt burden worsens. But if income grows 3%, you start growing your way out. The debt burden shrinks. This is the secret to beautiful deleveraging. The central bank prints enough money to push nominal growth above the nominal interest rate, but not so much that it creates unacceptable inflation or currency devaluation. This is exactly what the Federal Reserve did in 2008. Learning from 1930s mistakes, when the Fed acted too slowly, Chairman Ben Bernanke and his team moved fast. They slashed interest rates to zero. When that wasn't enough, they started quantitative easing, a modern term for printing money and buying financial assets. This massive money injection turned what could have been a decade-long depression into a severe but much shorter recession. It was painful, yes, but a beautiful deleveraging compared to what might have been. Contrast this with the Great Depression. In the early 1930s, the U.S. was on the gold standard, meaning the government promised to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed price. This tied the Fed's hands. They couldn't just print money because they feared people would rush to exchange those new dollars for their limited gold supply. Their fear of breaking the gold link kept monetary policy too tight for too long. They let thousands of banks fail, destroying credit and savings. The result was an ugly, deflationary depression lasting years. The turning point came in 1933 when President Franklin Roosevelt did the unthinkable. He took the United States off the gold standard. This finally allowed the Fed to print the money needed to fight the depression. The moment the dollar was devalued and printing began, the economy and stock market bottomed out and began their long recovery. In the end, Dalio says, policymakers always print money. Because austerity is too painful, debt restructurings wipe out wealth too fast, and large-scale wealth transfers almost never happen peacefully. Printing money is the most expedient, least painful path. The only question is how long they take to get there. Now, this entire story describes what Dalio calls a deflationary deleveraging, typically happening in countries with debts in their own currency, like the US, UK, and Japan. But there's another, even more chaotic crisis type, the inflationary deleveraging. This typically hits countries that have borrowed heavily in foreign currency. Think Latin American countries borrowing in US dollars, or one of history's most famous examples, Germany after World War I. The problem with foreign currency debt is the country's central bank can't print it. The German central bank could print marks, but not the French francs or British pounds needed for war reparations. The cycle starts similarly, with foreign capital fueling a boom. But when the tide turns and that capital wants out, the country faces a terrible choice. To stop capital flight, the central bank must raise interest rates to incredibly high levels to convince investors to keep money in the country. But these crushing rates devastate the already weak domestic economy. The alternative is letting capital flee. As investors sell local currency to buy foreign currency, the local currency's value plummets. This is a currency crisis. A falling currency makes anything imported skyrocket in price, causing massive inflation. Meanwhile, for anyone with foreign currency debt, the burden explodes. Imagine owing $10,000, and your local currency gets cut in half against the dollar. Suddenly you owe twice as much in local currency terms. This creates an inflationary depression, a brutal combination of contracting economy and runaway inflation. The most iconic case is Germany's Weimar Republic in the early 1920s. Crushed by impossible war reparations, the government printed marks relentlessly to buy needed foreign currency. This triggered capital flight, currency collapse, and eventually hyperinflation. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. By late 1923, prices doubled every few days. The entire money supply that existed in Germany in 1913 would barely buy a loaf of bread. Money lost all meaning. People resorted to barter. The economic chaos wiped out the middle class and created deep social and political instability that paved the way for extremism in the 1930s. Dalio shows these hyperinflations aren't random acts of insanity. They're the logical, though tragic, result of trapped policymakers. They don't close the gap between income and spending and keep printing money to cover the difference, often because the alternative is complete economic collapse or even foreign invasion. The printing seems like the least bad option at the time, but feeds an inflation spiral that becomes impossible to stop without radical change. To end hyperinflation, a country must essentially hit the reset button. They need to create a new, credible currency, backed by hard assets or a credible promise to stop printing. And they must balance their budget through painful austerity. There's no easy way out. Whether it's deflationary or inflationary depression, Dalio's template reveals the same underlying mechanics. The cycles are driven by the logical ebb and flow of credit and human psychology. Booms create unsustainable bubbles. Bubbles burst. And the following deleveraging is either managed beautifully with a balanced mix of all four levers, or becomes an ugly, painful crisis, leaving deep scars for years. The biggest risks, he says, aren't from the debts themselves. The biggest risks come from policymakers failing to do the right things, either from lack of knowledge or lack of authority. After guiding us through these cycles, Dalio zooms out to show the even bigger picture. He touches on war economies, showing how major conflicts often result from economic rivalries and internal strife building during these long-term debt cycles. The economic pain of the 1930s depression, for example, fueled the rise of populist, nationalist, and militaristic leaders in Germany and Japan, leading directly to World War II. These wars are ultimate reset buttons, establishing new world orders with new dominant powers and new reserve currencies. This sets the stage for long periods of peace and prosperity, during which the next long-term debt cycle begins, slowly and surely building toward the next crisis. It's a pattern repeating as long as credit has existed, going back before Roman times. Even the Old Testament described the need to wipe out all debts every 50 years in what was called the Year of Jubilee. But here's the final, hopeful message. While these crises feel devastating and world-ending when we're in them, they're just bumps along the way. When you look at charts of real per capita income over the last 100 years, even the worst depressions look like small dips in a powerful upward climbing line. The force truly driving long-term prosperity isn't debt cycle management, but productivity. Human ingenuity, our ability to learn, create, and build, is far more powerful than credit cycles. Understanding the template doesn't mean we can avoid the cycles. They're part of human nature. But understanding them gives us a choice. As individuals, we can be better prepared. As a society, we can demand our leaders manage them better. We can choose beautiful deleveraging over ugly deleveraging. We can choose understanding over fear. And by doing so, we can make the bumps a little smaller and the upward path of progress a little smoother for everyone. As we wrap up our journey through Ray Dalio's work, it's easy to feel like we've just completed a masterclass in economics. And, in many ways, we have. But I think the most powerful lesson isn't just about monetary policy or inflation rates. It's about perspective. Most of us experience the world day by day. We watch news, see markets fluctuate, and it all feels like a blizzard of random, disconnected events. It's confusing and often scary. What Dalio offers is a way to step out of that blizzard. He hands us a map showing that what looks like chaos is actually repeating patterns driven by logic and human nature. It's like the difference between being a soldier on the battlefield and being the general on the hill overlooking the whole war. The soldier sees only chaos directly ahead. The general sees strategy, turning points, the inevitable ebb and flow of conflict. This book gives you the general's perspective. And this isn't just a tool for investors or presidents. It's for anyone wanting to navigate life with more wisdom and less fear. When you understand that economies, like nature, move in cycles, like seasons, you start seeing the world differently. Periods of boom and prosperity are like summer. They feel wonderful, but don't last forever. Periods of downturn and crisis are like winter, harsh and difficult, but they too shall pass, and they're necessary for clearing excesses and preparing ground for new growth. This perspective helps you avoid two massive mistakes: euphoria in good times and despair in bad times. When everyone's caught up in a bubble, you can have wisdom to be cautious. When everyone's panicking during a crash, you can have courage to see opportunity on the other side. The most practical takeaway for me is the idea of the four levers: austerity, debt restructuring, printing money, and wealth redistribution. Next time you see a government responding to crisis, whether in your country or across the world, try identifying which levers they're pulling. Are they leaning too heavily on austerity, risking ugly deflationary spiral? Are they printing money? And are they doing it in a balanced way to achieve beautiful deleveraging? Just this simple categorization gives you clarity that 99% of people lack. And what about your own life? While you can't print money, you have your own version of these levers. You can practice austerity by spending less. You can restructure debts. You can increase income, which is like your personal printing money. You can find balance. This template isn't just for big debt crises. It's for understanding any system where borrowing, lending, ambition, and fear are at play. That was the book summary of A Template for Understanding Big Debt Crises by Ray Dalio. We've certainly covered the big ideas today, but I'll be honest, a summary, no matter how detailed, is like looking at a postcard of the Grand Canyon. The real experience, the real awe, comes from standing at the edge yourself. The real magic of this book is in the details, the granular, day-by-day accounts of historical crises that make these abstract concepts feel real and visceral. This summary is your guide to decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today sparked your curiosity or made you see the world a bit differently, I truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning. It's an investment in a new and more powerful way of seeing the world. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring ideas in the world's most powerful books, please hit that subscribe button. It tells us we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.